It's my pleasure to please request Gordon back on stage. We also have, if Donna's mic'd up, Donna Anderson from T. Rowe Price, and we'll do the introduction shortly. And we have Spiro, who's the enterprise risk leader from SunTrust Bank, and we'll do a quick introduction soon as well. So we did some quick introductions, and I think, Gordon, you've been introduced well, so I'm not going to ask you to repeat that. But I'll just hand it over to Donna quickly to give a quick background, on yourself and the company you represent.
Okay, sure. Well, my title is Head of Corporate Governance at T. Rowe Price, but I'm not actually a GRC professional, which makes me sort of wonder whether I should have taken the pledge a few minutes ago. For us, so my role in this conversation is to bring the outside perspective. As head of corporate governance for a very large global asset manager, T. Rowe Price has about $850 billion under management for clients globally in a variety of investment strategies. We are interacting with your boards of directors, your senior managements, and asking questions about risk and strategy and capital allocation and board diversity and sort of all those elements that increase our chances of meeting our investment goals with the company. So I'm not a GRC expert, but I'm here to kind of provide what are outside stakeholders and investors looking for.
Spiro, we'll go to you next.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. Spiro Karetsos, and when I talked to Gaurav, I said, why don't you put me down as a financial industry representative, because I want to bring forward my 10 years of working with the Federal Reserve from a regulatory perspective. I want to share my time with Goldman Sachs from being in the investment banking space. I want to share my time with Vanguard when I was in investment management, and now at SunTrust. But I also want to share an industry perspective because I'm on the board of directors of the Risk Management Association. I'm an executive committee member of the board, and one of our responsibilities is to make sure that we're increasing risk awareness and developing risk professionals for the future. So I'd like to bring that entire portfolio together for today's discussion.
Thank you, Spiro. Oh, closer.
Closer?
Yeah.
That better? Great.
Thank you. So, first, thanks, Gordon, for your interesting presentation around how things are changing quite rapidly in the consumer payments world and the banking world. The last time we had this panel, it was actually in London in November, where we'd asked people to poll, what risks are the highest risks in the world at that time. It was one day before the presidential election in the US. And almost unanimously, there was among the top 5 risks, I think, there was the US presidential election. It was a high risk, but exceptionally low probability. And remember, this was one day before the election. It happened, and we know what happened. My question is, I'll probably start with you, Gordon. What are business leaders thinking today as probably the top 3 risks? How have they changed in the last, couple of years? And what do you see changing in the next 5 years?
Well, it's almost dangerous, I think, just to focus on one or two things. I want to just describe kind of, I think, a way of life in business that is really important to manage risk, which is, if I take, my own leadership team, it includes a general auditor, it includes the risk management team, it includes the head of compliance, internal controls. Those people largely don't report to me at all, but they are around the table for every single management meeting. So they see what the businesses are facing, they see what the businesses are thinking and considering. They have complete independence, but they are integrated into the team so that they're integrated into the information flow. Specifically, back to your question, I would ask all of you who are involved in the areas of lending money, whether that's in auto finance or leasing or mortgages, but also be really focused on those activities. It's been a very long time now that the credit performance, if you like, has been, just very benign, and it'll begin to return to its historical norms over a period of time from here. And so sometimes we can, after a long period of let's call it drought, people can take their eye off some of those key learnings. But obviously, the geopolitical issues that Shelley alluded to earlier are things we all have to stay very close to.
And Donna, from a corporate governance perspective, how have you seen things changing over the last few years in terms of what is top of mind?
Well, sort of two themes come to mind. One is a lot of investors have a lot of opinions about how your boards should be managing risk, kind of generally speaking. We, on the investment side at T. Rowe, don't have a house view about this. I mean, we've seen boards where the entire responsibility for risk management is spread across the whole board, some where it resides with the audit committee, some where it resides with a separate risk committee. Obviously, we want the company to do what is appropriate for your business, so we don't have a house view, we don't advocate for that. But we are obviously looking to understand why the board is set up the way it is. The area of cybersecurity is a really good example, I think, lately. A lot of investors are interested in this. Obviously, we do view it as a significant investment risk. Some investors advocate for having a cybersecurity expert on the board, but there's a lot of issues with that. One is there aren't that many of those people who have the capacity to take on board service in addition to their rather demanding jobs. One is there's kind of an age gap, to be honest, between your typical cybersecurity expert and your typical board member. There's sort of a sourcing issue. Another is, a board seat is very valuable real estate. You really need everybody around that table to be well-rounded and to be bringing a lot of different contexts, to make decisions. And so the notion of specialists, a group of specialists, narrow specialists around a table is not the traditional board dynamic. And then the other challenge is disclosure. That's an area where investors are clamoring for a lot of disclosure, but it's probably not in our interests, honestly, for you to be, that forthcoming with your cybersecurity plans and programs. So it's, again, we are just looking for the company to have sort of a good rationale and, good answers to questions about why you're structured the way you are. But this is an area where, I think often you shouldn't really listen to investors. They're not always right about that. The second theme in my sort of small world of corporate governance on the regulatory front is this uncertainty. Every other market where we invest is heading the other way, and that is giving shareholders more rights and more responsibility. We're kind of trending in most markets to a system of shareholder, sort of mandatory votes on compensation, for instance. If you can't get your compensation plan past your shareholders, you can't implement it, that kind of thing. In this market, we're actually unwinding shareholder rights as fast as we can. So this is an area where perhaps your interests are different from mine, but we don't see this as a good thing. We've kind of come a long way from having very poor shareholder rights in general in the US to sort of being in the middle of the pack, and there's a lot of legislation and proposed kind of rollback of rules at the SEC and Congress right now that would take us back to where we were about 15 years ago. So that's definitely something keeping corporate governance people up at night.
And Spiro, thank you, Donna. And Spiro, you've got a pretty unique perspective, having worked in different organizations, but also as a board member of the RMA. What are you hearing the most?
Yeah, so I think if any of you have an enterprise risk function or an operational risk function, you'll typically see that they'll maintain a portfolio of exposures. You might see it in the version of a heat map. There's some evergreen exposures over the past 3 years, 5 years that have been out there. So you typically have your cyber exposures, your third party, which is now extending to fourth party exposures, concern about your data, where is your data, where is it residing, to the extent your data may move to cloud-based computing, specifically if it's public cloud. Those are the evergreens that have been sitting out there. But I would say over the past year, there's a new dynamic of exposures. And if you thought the ones I referenced before were qualitative, the ones I'm going to tell you right now are even softer. And you have to think about the how you do things more so than what you do these days. So while you can talk about products and services and capabilities and revenues and financial exposure, the question that people are asking these days is, how are you offering these products? What are your business practices? Are they fair? Do people trust you? And if you're failing in those spaces, potentially from a sales practice perspective, and it's not just the financial services industry, the airlines were hit really hard this year with their practices. I mean, they were following their rules, but the way they treated their customers and their clients was not considered to be appropriate, and it really impacted their reputational damage. So now you've got to start moving into the how and focus on your culture, your conduct, and your capabilities more so than the what you're offering and the types of exposures you have in that space.
That's a great perspective, Spiro. And if I just flip the question around, you started talking about how to do it and what there could be opportunity. Earlier, Gordon, you talked about risk and opportunity. Both Shelley also talked about Uber, that for the taxi cab companies, Uber is not just a risk, but you've got to figure out how to conquer that if you've got to survive. So taking a slightly different perspective, Spiro, I'll start with you. Actually, what do risk managers have a seat on the strategy table of companies or not, or still not yet?
No, I think if you have a mature risk management program, you should just be given a seat at the table. You should earn a seat at the table. And the way we earn a seat at the table is we believe that risk management has to have an ROI component to it. And it starts in the strategic space. We want to be part of seed ideas and identifying where those exposures are on seed ideas. We have a risk research team, and that's very new. Not many functions have a risk research team. That research team is identifying opportunities where we can push the envelope and take on more risk and not just reduce risk exposure. And then finally, we've been bringing risk appetite to the table, to the forefront of every discussion. It's no longer the time where you can put a blanket statement out there and say that you have a moderate risk appetite as a company. Risk appetite has to be broken down component by component, building block by building block. A building block is a cross-section between a type of risk, like credit exposure, and a business area, like consumer, like Gordon's world. And once you break down every risk that you face by every entity you face it in, for every block, you can start identifying how much risk you want to take on. And in some areas, you want to be aggressively pushing the risk because there's a good return on the other side of the equation. In other areas, you may choose to be more conservative because the potential damage or opportunity cost outweighs the risk of non-controlling the environment. So you have to really analyze every risk, and you have to think about the appetite where there's a risk-return relationship, and mostly that's credit, market, and strategic, or where there's a risk-opportunity cost relationship where you're trying to figure out how much you're going to spend to control something versus how much you're willing to live with from an exposure perspective.
Thanks, Spiro. Gordon, I'm going to take the question to you. I personally actually spent over a decade at Citi in the consumer business, and I never used to like the risk and audit and compliance professionals. They're almost an impediment to the growth of the business. I'm going to ask you, with the role you have today, how do you look at the risk managers, and how do you look at taking their help in understanding opportunity, not just a post-assurance function?
Well, as I said earlier, that all of the risk disciplines are equal, and that's a very important distinction, are equal partners at the table. And honestly, I think the best business people are really good risk managers too. We all face a set of risks in business which have never existed before, because almost every member of the population is now a movie director. So what do I mean by that? Just look at some of the recent events. These types of situations that have hit the media have always existed in some way, shape, or form, but there haven't been, dozens or hundreds of people at the moment there with a video camera called a phone and the ability to post it onto YouTube. So, that's a whole set of, whole area of evolving risk that only having people working together, risk management teams with an equal say at the table, and business people who factor risk into everything that they are doing.
Thank you. Just taking that concept a little further, you talk about everybody's a movie director, right, today. one of the key themes we constantly hear about is, if you know, from a lot of our customers, and Spiro, you talked about it briefly, is about culture. So you can set the tone from the top, but if it doesn't converge with the bottoms up, there'll be trouble at some stage. Yeah? So Donna, maybe request you to take that question. How do you ensure that the culture, the tone is consistent throughout the organization, and the top-down meets the bottom-up?
Well, I'm not sure I have great advice about how to do it, but I've seen examples where it's clearly not working, so I'll give you that. The cautionary tale, I guess. One new development with regard to public companies and their shareholders is a lot more direct interaction between board members and investors. That used to be pretty uncommon in the US market and is now much more common for a variety of reasons, but basically because of the increase in shareholder rights that I mentioned before. And so it's not at all uncommon now for us and our portfolio managers to be sitting across the table from a lead director, chairman, or a committee chair from your board, with or without adult supervision from management in the room. And so I guess authenticity is the risk that I think of when I think of companies trying to demonstrate tone at the top, but they can't back it up. So a couple examples are, we're a very large shareholder of a personnel firm, I would say sort of high-end placements and consulting. It's the firm is all about people. That's all they have. They don't have buildings and the footprint. They just, people is their business. And so the chair of that firm came to talk to us about talent and how they're competing and how the environment is, how important diversity is to them. Oh, diversity is so important. We have this big women's leadership program. Retention of our women is so important in the consulting business. All of that, and they just almost had us convinced. But he was accompanied by his head of HR and his head of investor relations. And when the meeting ended and they were heading out the door, it was all, so girls, where are we going to lunch now? So would you girls like to go to the little girls' room before we hit the? It was so demeaning and so and you could tell that these women were not empowered to do anything about it or to kick them in the shins or just like it was. And we were like, we're still sitting here. We can still observe the behavior even though the meeting is over. It just destroyed their whole message about we are investing in people and we're enlightened and we're like all about diversity. Another example was this epically horrible meeting where a board came to convince us that they had an activist. So shareholder activism is another new movement on the horizon in corporate governance land. This company has been underperforming for 10 years, very dominant, strong, overwhelming, I would say, kind of leader founder in the CEO chair role. And an activist came after them and said, we think this board needs a few independently minded people on it. And so they brought the board members and the board lead independent director and the CEO to convince us that they didn't need outside intervention. The board was perfectly independent from management already. And so that was great. We were happy to hear more about that. But every time the lead director wanted to say anything, she asked permission of the CEO first. She would lean over and say, hey, Steve, can I make a point? And then he would either say yes or no before she could speak. And the whole point of being there was to demonstrate the board's independence from management. I mean, these are things that are sort of coming up new as board members and investors have more direct contact. But I mean, I would say as a basic protection, I mean, people, you gotta actually, believe what you're saying before you go before outside parties.
No, thanks, Donna. Interesting. And Spiro, you were one of the first people, I think 5 or 6 years ago, when we were interacting to talk about how to align compensation, for example, to the risk world, right? So what do you think, taking a little bit from what Donna just mentioned about culture, combining it with what are the ways to actually get the culture organized better? And what are the typical challenges that you are seeing in your organizations on breaking these silos within the organization?
So a couple of things on that front. First of all, I've been very lucky to have been part of purpose-driven organizations in my career. But if you hear the tone from the top and the culture that's preached from those organizations, they're only as strong as the echo from the bottom. And in many ways, you measure the echo from the bottom as the conduct and the behaviors from those in the bottom. So we're constantly focusing on ensuring that there's parity and that the culture and the tone from the top is in sync with the behaviors and actions and echo from the bottom. And one of the ways to reinforce that is through the compensations programs. And when we talk about incentives, it can't only be downside. Just like there isn't downside of risk management, there's also the upside of risk management. The same thing for performance management. So if you're going to include risk management capabilities in someone's performance management, annual review, mid-tier review, ongoing discussions, you have to be willing to recognize the positive things that they do. We look for testimonials. We look for managers to raise their hands when there are heroic efforts and someone's identified a problem or an opportunity area. And we have to be able to recognize those opportunities. Otherwise, you won't have a culture where people will be willing to raise their hand. But there also need to be consequences. So when behaviors aren't as expected in the organization, regardless of the level of the employee, if the organization is true to its purpose, true to its tone from the top, true to its culture, there have to be repercussions. And there have to be repercussions in a manner where there's recourse. And in many instances, where peers or other employees understand the reason for that recourse. So we found that you can't just take negative events and brush them under the carpet. You need to have testimonials where management teams raise their hand, highlight where things have gone wrong, highlight what they're doing to improve it. And from that perspective, we now have an environment in which people can be openly discussing risk management. And at the end of the day, know that if we raise our hand early, we get the right people involved, and we can swarm a problem. Not only can we minimize its impact, because risk is not like wine. You know why risk isn't like wine? It doesn't get better with age, right? You want to identify risk quickly. And if you identify risk quickly, you can swarm it, address it, and minimize the impact. And we recognize people positively for that. We don't want the opposite behavior where they're trying to solve problems on their own or figure out a way to potentially cover it up. That's the negative behavior, the negative culture you're looking for. So if you want the positive risk culture, you have to incent it, you have to reward it, and you have to recognize it.
Thanks. Thanks, Pira. I thought you were about to say it's not like wine because red is not good. But red wine is good. So, Gordon, from your perspective, one of the things that we hear constantly now is banks are becoming technology companies here. You know, I've heard this on this podium from companies like Citi and MasterCard and many others. So how do you see both the spend but the view that business managers and CEOs like you have around technology, and not just overall technology? I mean, there's obviously a lot of movement happening. You covered some, Shelley in her keynote covered some, but how do you view technology as an enabler to manage risk better as you see the future?
Well, I absolutely believe financial services companies, banks specifically, are becoming technology companies, as are many other industries. We spend billions of dollars every year in the technology space. And I think what's really important for business people and for risk managers is to make sure you're staying current. I so often see people who just effectively gave up learning. You can run into people who have retired at the age of 25 and it just make up an age, but effectively they've just stopped learning. And so, how are people interacting on social media? Which sites are they using? How are they using? How is Instagram now working for Facebook? What's the implications from a marketing perspective on the growth of Snapchat versus Instagram? Just how are people using the technologies is becoming vitally important, and business and risk people actually really have to understand it. No, they don't have to sit and write code, but they have to be able to understand what the capabilities are, what the power is, what the potential is for of the technology as it continues to evolve. So, I could not push hard enough that just keep learning for everyone who's in business, because we are all, like it or not, in technology companies. I started life as a COBOL programmer, which anybody who's a technologist will laugh, because you have to hunt a long way to find a COBOL programmer today. It's not the most modern language.
Seems like you should have been able to handle that MP3
yeah.
player better.
I should, shouldn't I? It should have been much easier.
Just, we needed a COBOL programmer once. We posted it online for months. We couldn't find anyone.
Yeah.
We put the newspaper ad in the paper. We found someone in a week.
I should have called.
Yeah. So thanks, Gordon. Sorry. Spiro, so you've obviously, as part of the last 10, 15 years, been exposed to a lot of technology around risk, with processes changing and technologies changing. What do you think are the biggest 3 or 4 areas of investments now that companies are looking at in terms of GRC technology?
Yeah, I like the partnership that Gordon's talking about, because so often I see risk trying to make a business case for a new technology, and they call it regulatory required to try to make the business case. And the business trying to make a case for a technology that's quite similar, but yet they don't have enough of a business case on an ROI perspective. But we pair them up, and a great example of where you can pair them up is voice to text. So clients are calling in, and you may have a client center that can't catch on to certain terms that they're using to either A, identify that they're a great prospect for some other services that you may offer, potential advisory services, or you may not catch on the fact that they're not formally complaining, but they're whining about something. So if you go from voice to text and then apply text analytics, we found is risk and business can partner together. Business can start analyzing the text analytics and start really identifying their clients that have needs that their services and products can help with. And it serves as a great prospecting tool, and you can do callback strategies to get to the right people with your informed sales personnel, and hopefully the hit rate's much stronger and you're helping client needs. But you also don't have to wait for a client to complain. Complaints are almost so far downstream right now. If you really want to address client concerns, understand when their tone is negative about something. Figure out what we can do to learn about that, and then pair that data up. If they're whining about something today, they're going to be complaining about it tomorrow. If they're complaining about it tomorrow, at some point it's going to be an audit issue, a risk issue, a regulatory issue, or a compliance issue. And then at some point, it's going to be a lawsuit or a settlement, right? That's typically the way this thing tracks. So if you want to get uphill on the battle, start really dealing with where your clients are at the gate. And I love the construct that Gordon talked about earlier, where if you're part of corporate, you've got to leave the ivory tower. And you've got to get out into a branch, and you got to talk to, in our financial services industry, the folks on the front line, and ask them what challenges that they face. Ask them if they understand what our culture is and what we're trying to promote. And then ask them what the client's sentiment is. You get so much intel from the folks on the front line. On my first day of work, I had to open an account, and I'm a risk manager. So when I transferred my bank account, I sat with the branch representative, and I just said, hey, just out of curiosity, what are the things that really bother you? What makes it hard for you to do your job? And what makes it hard for you to service me as a client? And I learned more in that 1 hour of spending time in the branch and opening up all my accounts. And when I went to my first meeting with the executives, they were so surprised that I knew where the sweet spots were out of the gate. And they wanted to know how I did my due diligence. And I said, you really have to talk to the people that are interacting with your clients and running your business.
Thanks, bro. Given the time, I'm going to request each of you in one sentence, one piece of wisdom, on how business leaders here can actually make their organizations tie their risk program and governance programs for better business performance. What's the 2 things, 1 or 2 things that they should think about? I'll start with you, Gordon.
I would push on this. Simplicity is innovation and will lead to phenomenal risk management. Complexity is always the enemy. It will lead to process failures. It will lead to employee frustration. It will lead to customer frustration. So simplicity is one of the greatest tools we have. It's exceptionally easy to say, much harder to deliver, and frequently overlooked.
Thank you. Donna?
Well, again, all my experience in this area is looking at it kind of at the leadership level. When I think about our own corporate experience, one that always sticks with me in the area of kind of leadership and authenticity is when we launched our own phishing program, right? The kind of the testing program that employees would get embedded, phishing type messages as a test for awareness and training purposes. And one of our senior, like very senior executives, was one of the first ones to fall for it. And IT and security actually report up to him, so it was awkward. But he's very public about it. I've heard him talk about it in about 5 different town halls. And that freedom to sort of create an admission of mistakes, a learning environment instead of a fear environment has been really powerful when I think about kind of the signal that gives employees in the town halls when they know that everybody makes a mistake like that.
Thank you. That's good insight. And Spiro?
So I'm going to take a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, and the pinnacle, what we're trying to get to, is what I'll focus on at the end. But if you think about what we start with, we have raw data. We have whatever's available to you from your systems perspective, whatever you can survey, whatever you can get at. And then you go from raw data to big data, where you're actually starting to analyze it. And then you're going from big data to reporting, right? And the people that stopped at reporting, but what they didn't realize is in their reporting, they're now giving hundreds and hundreds of pages and schematics and visuals to managers and board members. And what they're missing is the pinnacle, which is storytelling. Storytelling is a lost art. And I'm going to tell you that your responsibility, if you want to be in the GRC space, if you want to be in the risk management space, is you are the chief risk storyteller of your organization. You have to find what the elements of the story are, and you have to weave it and integrate it in such a manner that it can be interpreted, it can be understood, and people can be action-oriented around your story.
As you can see, Spiro has been a masterful storyteller. What we'll do is we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, in the audience. And first, let me thank you, Gordon, Donna, and Spiro. Very diverse set of, opinions and advice for the audience. So thank you.
Hello, good morning. This is Lady Michelle from SunPower. I have a question for Gordon. You mentioned about risk managers and business owners having the same or equal, they are equal on the table. So how do you make sure that your risk managers and business owners in your company are actually collaborating, and how's your organization structured to make sure that it happens?
Yeah, well, we're structured in such a way that the key functions report independently, so they truly have total independence. So I'm not involved in their compensation or any of those factors, so I think that's very important. But they're always around the table, so every forum that I hold, whether it's a weekly staff meeting, whether it's a strategic offsite, whether it's a town hall where we're communicating to thousands of people, risk and control, auditors are all part of the same discussion. I was really touched by Donna's diversity point. It's a very, very good one. You can't set a tone at the top through PowerPoint. Everyone looks for where is the gaps. And people look to see our management, our leadership actually walking the talk. And I think by making people at each level in the organization part of the management team as an integrated business, then you really start to get that layer upon layer upon layer through the organization, rather than just something that's articulated through PowerPoint. So really, a level of independence, but a level of integration in terms of people being aware of anything and everything and open sharing of data and information.
We'll have time for 2 more questions.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
This is Sharad Joshi from DTCC New York. This is a question for anyone in the panel. When you look at risk, there are so many metrics that you can actually look at. How do you focus on, metrics that matter from risk perspective? Anyone from the panel, please?
Do you want to take this, Spiro?
Sure. So if you think about metrics, you can count almost anything. So what we try to do is go from what metrics could we get our hands on to what metrics are aligned to the story that we want to tell. And then once we start that alignment, then we start narrowing down those metrics to which we think are the ones that are key. And then if they're key, we start asking ourselves, are they leading or lagging? What you find is typically most metrics are lagging. We're trying to do much more in the forecasting space, but we still find we have to use a lot of lagging indicators to get there. So it takes a lot of time to digest first what's available. And I will tell you that a lot of times we sit at the table and we want to identify new metrics. But if those new metrics aren't used by the business and they don't believe that those metrics are valuable because they never collected in the past, it's really hard to say we're going to create new metrics for you as a business area. So definitely start with what exists, figure out what element of the story it tells. Does it tell a little bit of the backstory, or is it foreshadowing a little bit? And then bring together the best of what's available to help tell a story. But always be cautious of a false sense of precision of what the data is telling you. Always get qualitative perspective to layer in your quantitative and your qualitative together so your story has more richness.
Thank you. Any last question? We passed the time, but one last question. Anybody? I think everybody's ready for a break. All right.
Thank
so
you,
once
Gaurav.
again, thank you. Thank you, Gordon. Thanks, Donna.